If you are watching this within the last hour, you are watching this at exactly the right moment. Because what is unfolding right now across 3 continents simultaneously is not just a war story, it is an economic story. And the number at the center of it, $3 trillion, is so large, so abstract, so difficult to visualize that most people hear it and feel nothing. So let me make you feel it. India's entire gross domestic product, everything produced by 1.4 billion people in an entire year, is approximately $3.2 trillion. We are talking about the potential erasure of nearly that entire figure from the global economy, not from one country, from the world, in months, possibly weeks. And the mechanisms by which that destruction travels from a narrow strip of water in the Persian Gulf to your grocery store, your gas pump, and your pension account are already in motion. This is not a forecast. This is not a worst-case scenario drafted by think tanks in air-conditioned offices. This is what the data, taken from multiple institutions including the World Economic Forum, Deloitte, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the United Nations, is showing right now, in real time, as the conflict in the Middle East enters a phase that analysts are describing as a structural shock to the entire world economy. To understand what is at stake, you need to understand one body of water, the Strait of Hormuz. It is a narrow passage between Iran and Oman at its tightest point, only 21 miles wide, and through it, every single day in normal times, flows 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products. 20 million barrels. That is roughly 20% of all the oil traded on Earth. It also carries approximately 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas. The fertilizers that feed billions of people in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America flow through it. Helium, essential for semiconductor manufacturing, flows through it. The lifeblood of the modern industrial economy flows through it, and right now that flow has been brought functionally to a halt. Ship transits through the strait have dropped to near zero. 150 vessels have dropped anchor in the waterway, waiting. Jebel Ali Port in Dubai, one of the busiest container ports on Earth, handling goods that reach consumers from London to Los Angeles, suspended operations after aerial strikes. Maritime insurance premiums have spiked so dramatically that many commercial operators are simply refusing to enter the region at all. The cost of moving goods through the world's most critical shipping lanes is no longer just expensive. In many cases, it is impossible. And here is what that means for the rest of the world, because this is the part that does not make the front page, and it should. Oil prices have surged more than 45% since late February. Natural gas prices are up 55%. Fertilizer prices, specifically urea, the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that most of the world's crops depend on, have risen 30% in the past month alone. The timing of that fertilizer shock is not incidental, it is brutal. Northern Hemisphere spring planting season is beginning right now. Farmers from Canada to Brazil to India to sub-Saharan Africa are making purchasing decisions this week against a backdrop of price spikes they could not have anticipated and cannot absorb. What is being planted in the ground this spring under these conditions will determine what is available on supermarket shelves in 6 months. The food shock from this conflict has not arrived yet. What we are watching right now is the fuse being lit. The United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific has issued a warning that growth across developing Asian economies could slow to 4% in 2026, down from 4.6% in 2025. That sounds like a small number. It is not. For countries where hundreds of millions of people live close to the poverty line, a single percentage point of lost growth translates into lost jobs, lost wages, reduced food security, and worsened inequality. The International Labor Organization's economist put it plainly, and I want you to hear exactly what he said. The risk, he warned, is that an external economic shock becomes a household crisis. An external economic shock becoming a household crisis. That sentence should stop you. Because it is not describing Tehran, it is not describing Tel Aviv, it is describing families in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Colombia, in Nigeria, people who have no stake in this conflict, who could not find the Strait of Hormuz on a map, whose governments played no role in starting this war, and who will nonetheless pay for it through higher food prices, reduced income, and deteriorating living standards. Now let us go to the financial markets, because the damage there is already visible and already severe. On April 4th of this year, before this current escalation, global markets suffered one of the most dramatic single-day losses in modern history. $3.25 trillion evaporated in a single trading session. That crash was triggered by tariff announcements, not by bombs. What analysts are now calculating is what happens when you combine the tariff shock that was already reverberating through supply chains with an energy shock of the magnitude currently unfolding. The phrase being used in financial research is the mother of all bad timings. Europe, which was just beginning to show tentative signs of economic recovery after years of stagnation, now faces an energy shock layered directly on top of a trade shock. Asia, which depends on Gulf energy imports to power its factories and feed its populations, is being hit simultaneously through energy, food, and supply chain channels. The United States, despite being a major domestic oil producer, is watching gasoline prices climb at a moment when consumers are already stretched and inflation is already politically toxic. The Council on Foreign Relations has calculated that each $10 per barrel increase in the price of oil slows United States growth by approximately 1/10 of a percentage point of GDP. Oil prices have risen by $30 per barrel since the start of this conflict. Do the math. That is 3/10 of a point of GDP growth being subtracted from the American economy, and that estimate assumes the conflict remains contained at current levels. It does not account for further escalation. It does not account for a sustained closure of the strait. It does not account for the scenarios that analysts are gaming out behind closed doors at major financial institutions and defense ministries right now. And this brings us to the question that every serious economist, every energy analyst, every geopolitical strategist is wrestling with, and that no one has answered cleanly yet. What does the endgame look like? Because here is the problem. The Strait of Hormuz does not reopen because someone wishes it. It reopens when there is a political resolution that gives Iran a reason to allow it. And the conditions required to produce that resolution, given the military escalation of the past several weeks, given the domestic political constraints on all sides, given the gap between what Washington says is happening diplomatically and what Tehran says is happening diplomatically, those conditions do not currently exist. The Council on Foreign Relations put it this way: Washington faces two unattractive options. It can persuade Tehran to reopen the strait, which requires making difficult concessions it has so far refused to make. Or it can escalate the war further, including risking the loss of naval vessels and potentially deploying ground forces with all of the economic and human consequences that would follow. Neither path is clean, neither path is cheap, and neither path gets the world back to 20 million barrels a day through that narrow waterway without a cost that has not yet been fully priced by anyone. The World Economic Forum has said explicitly that the longer this conflict runs, the more lasting the damage becomes, not temporary, not recoverable in a quarter or two of growth. Lasting, structural, the kind of damage that reshapes trade routes, redirects investment decisions, permanently alters geopolitical alignments, and leaves scars on national economies that take years to understand and years more to heal. We have seen this before. The 1973 oil embargo accelerated France's nuclear energy program. The 1979 Iranian Revolution drove Japan to completely restructure its approach to energy efficiency. Those were single-event shocks. What is happening right now is not a single event. It is a conflict with no agreed endpoint involving a choke point that cannot be easily bypassed in a region where multiple powers have overlapping and contradictory interests at a moment when the world economy was already fragile from 2 years of tariff escalation and post-pandemic pressure. The Atlantic Council surveyed more than 350 global strategists and security experts earlier this year. 40% of them said they expected another world war defined as a multi-front conflict among great powers before 2035, 40%. And 62% of those same experts said they expected the world a decade from now to be worse off than it is today. These are not fringe voices. These are the people who advise governments, run defense ministries, and model the scenarios that determine how nations prepare for what comes next. Here is what we know with certainty as of this moment. Oil is up 45%, gas is up 55%, fertilizer is up 30%, the Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed, Jebel Ali port is suspended, maritime insurance has spiked, Asian growth forecasts are being revised downward, food prices are rising in regions that cannot absorb the increase. The financial damage from this conflict, if it remains at current levels, is already being measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. If it escalates further, if the energy infrastructure shock deepens, if alternative routes prove insufficient, if the diplomatic gaps that currently exist between Washington and Tehran cannot be bridged, the number that analysts keep returning to is $3 trillion. $3 trillion in cumulative global economic loss, the equivalent of an entire year of Indian economic output, gone. That number is not inevitable. It is a warning. And the question that matters most right now is not whether the missiles will stop flying. The question is whether the people with the power to stop them understand the cost of waiting any longer to find out. That gap between the economic reality unfolding in real time and the political will required to close the strait, that gap is not just a diplomatic problem. That gap has a price tag. And right now, that price tag is being paid by people who had no say in any of this at all.